Eddie Glaude, and I am the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. And welcome to the African American Studies podcast. I'm delighted to have with me today my new and brilliant colleague, Reena Goldthree. Professor Goldthree specializes in the history of Latin America and the Caribbean. Her research and teaching focus on social movements, political theory, labor and migration, and of course, Caribbean feminism. Her latest book is on the horizon, right? It's Democracy Shall Be No Empty Romance, War and the Politics of Empire in the Greater Caribbean. Beyond her upcoming book, her research has appeared in the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History, Labor, Studies in Working Class History of the Americas, Radical Teacher, Caribbean Military Encounters, and Global Circuits of Blackness, Interrogating the African Diasporas. She's also the co-editor of a special issue of the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Glad to have you. So talk with me about the new book. Give me a sense of how it emerged, right? What brought you to this particular subject?
Sure. So like so many other scholars, my research interests have emerged from an intersection of my personal trajectory and formal academic study. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, which is not a particularly Caribbean space, but it has been historically a flashpoint for conversation around race and rights, from Dred Scott decision to the uprising in Ferguson. So for a very long time, I've been thinking about the histories and geographies of Black freedom. This project in particular emerged during my first year in graduate school. I had the opportunity to take two courses that utterly transformed the spatial configuration of my research.
And this was at Duke University?
This was at Duke
Okay.
University. I took two classes with historian John French, who would go on to be my dissertation advisor. The first was a course called Afro-Diasporic Dialogues that looked at the historic ties between Black communities in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the United States. And the second was a course on Afro-Brazilian history. And in both of those courses, the decades after World War I emerged as a pivotal historical moment. All right, this is the moment in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean where you see the Negritude movement, Afro-Cubanismo, the indigenous movement in Haiti, the emergence and global spread of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Rastafari. And through all of those different Black movements, I saw the figure of Afro-Caribbean World War I veterans. And I thought, why is it in all of this amazing scholarship that I'm reading about Black transnationalism, Black cosmopolitanism, do I not see veterans at the forefront of that in this work, right? And so that kind of absence made me think about what is it that happens during World War I that generates all of these transnational movements in the decades after the war. Mm-hmm. In my book, I've explored the political and geographic trajectories of Afro-Caribbean veterans, thinking about the ways in which the migrations engendered by the war produce new understandings of race and empire in the Caribbean.
So talk a little bit about what you mean by the migrations after the war, right? So they're movements, right? Because you have, circum-Caribbean, you have all this. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the Afro-Caribbean soldiers and their families that I study in the book are the product of multiple migration. Mm-hmm. Before the war, many of the men who would ultimately enlist for military service were actually labor migrants. So they are men who are moving from some of the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles, places like Grenada and St. Vincent, to the southern Caribbean island of Trinidad. But even more spectacularly, tens of thousands of men are moving to Central America, in particular to build the Panama Canal. Mm-hmm. So that for many of the men who served in World War I from the Caribbean, the war is not the first migration for them. It's their first time in Europe, but many of these men have already experienced multiple migrations, whether southward in the Caribbean or westward to Central America, or less commonly south to places like the Brazilian Amazon as labor migrants, right? So they already had an understanding of what it meant to move across national, imperial, and linguistic boundaries. During the war, we see a new circuit of migration emerge as Afro-Caribbean soldiers are stationed in Europe, they're stationed in North Africa and the Middle East, and as far away as India. And that these new migrations put them in conversation, quite literally, with colonial subjects from all over the world. So one of the things that I explore a great deal in the book is how military bases are sites of new forms of cosmopolitanism. Wow. I think about the ways in which, what does it mean if we think about a military base as a site of Black cosmopolitanism in the same way in which a literary salon in Paris might be, or a jazz cafe in Harlem?
So give me a sense of what the content of that cosmopolitanism is. It seems to me that it might be incredibly fraught because there are all of these kind of residual traces of imperial logics. There are notions of freedom that are kind of bound, that run up against and are bound up with some things that we might want to trouble. So give me a little bit more about the content of that cosmopolitanism.
So your instincts are absolutely right. On the one hand, military bases are sites where colonized subjects from across the world are coming into contact with one another. Mm-hmm. So in bases, for instance, you would often have, or bases are relatively closely linked military installations. You would have colonial troops from West Africa, contract workers from Asia, of course, colonial subjects from the Caribbean, and frequently African-American soldiers as well, right? Those spaces allowed for soldiers to ask new questions about the global modalities of race, how Blackness is constructed in multiple spaces, and also how colonialism works on a global scale. But that certainly didn't create any kind of utopia around shared ideas of race. One of the things that I discuss in great detail is the fractures around race, the ways in which West Indian soldiers often saw themselves as distinct from African colonial troops, and occasionally as distinct from Indian troops as well. They argued that they were literate soldiers, that they spoke English, that they were educated, and that they should be seen as one soldier wrote, a special class of natives.
Is that self-understanding bound up with a particular view of their relationship to the British Crown? All of these groups are in some ways British subjects. So what is the substance of that unique status that they're trying to possess, as it were?
So they're both cultural markers and markers around race and rights. One of them has to do with this status that is certainly more invoked than a status concretized through law of being an ancient and loyal subject of the British Crown.
Right.
A corollary status and phrase also exists for French Caribbean troops. This sense that Caribbean colonial subjects were among the oldest subjects in both the British and French empires, and therefore, by virtue of those deep and long-standing colonial ties, that they had earned rights that perhaps were not fully available to newer colonial subjects. Also, for the soldiers that I foreground in my work, their status as literate men was deeply important to them as well, and was a really an interesting thing to explore as a scholar, the ways in which literacy served as a tool not only to challenge the British Empire, but also as a tool of self-fashioning, as a tool to suggest a kind of distinction even among those who British officials often sought to lump together as colonized natives.
So what happens when they come home?
Oh, my goodness, so much. Right? The entire second half of the book really grapples with the 2 decades after World War I. Most immediately when they come home, you see a series of spectacular uprisings by soldiers. The largest of those would take place in British Honduras, which is the modern-day nation of Belize, where hundreds of soldiers would be joined by thousands of men, women, and children in the capital city in an uprising in July of 1919. You would see smaller uprisings in Trinidad, Jamaica, and elsewhere. Veterans also would join and form a wide array of political organizations immediately after their return. Veterans were at the forefront of the spread and radicalization of the UNIA in the Caribbean and also in the U.S. Veterans were also very involved in the spread of labor union organizing in the region. And veterans would also be very involved in leveraging loyalty. And this is one of the things that I'm interested in. The ways in which the experiences of discrimination and marginalization during the war didn't simply produce a break from imperial logics, a critique, a kind of militant anti-colonialism, but also led veterans to try to leverage their military service to make new demands upon the state, so that many veterans return and for the very first time feel as though they have a claim on the colonial state. A debt is often the language that they use. So they suggest that there is now a new relationship of mutual obligation, that no longer are they simply British subjects, but they articulate claims demanding citizenship, both in its political and economic resonances.
And so I suspect that the spark of many of these uprisings probably rooted in the failure of the attribution of that status in some form or fashion, right?
Absolutely. So during the war, West Indian veterans are able to gain really important concessions. They are paid on the exact same scale as British troops, meaning that whether you enlisted in Barbados or Bristol, you received the same base pay. And they enlisted with the explicit promise that they would be treated just as any other British soldier. Those promises fall apart relatively quickly, though, both during the war years, but particularly afterward, as British military officials refused to pay pensions and separation allowances, these allowances that were granted to soldiers' wives and children, on the same scale as British troops. And they also refused to provide the kind of welfare that was given to British soldiers. So things like unemployment allowances, robust health care support, and other things that helped veterans return to civilian life. And so many of the contestations deal with the large gap between the promise of serving on behalf of the British Empire and the lived realities of marginalization after the war.
So these are men,
yes,
moving about,
yes,
serving on behalf of the crown and on behalf of themselves and the nations from which they come. So what might your work how might your work speak to the role of masculinity, right, in the construction of the politics that emerges in this moment, if that makes sense?
No, it's a fantastic question, and a question that has animated this project from the very beginning. I have often thought about the ways in which, and there's a really rich literature about this, how our understandings of diaspora often privilege male actors. And so I was very worried about doing that same kind of work or being uncritically involved in that project. But what I think we can learn about masculinity is the ways in which the pursuit of both rights and political standing for Afro-Caribbean male soldiers is often predicated upon both martial understandings of manhood, right? And also understandings of a patriarchal male-headed household, which very rarely existed in the Caribbean context, particularly among Afro-Caribbean families, where there have historically been a variety of family formations, generally centered around the labor of women. And what you see here is an imperial state, in this case, the British imperial state, bestowing certain rights based on the ways in which soldiers could claim that their families reflected a model of the imperial family. Right. An example of that is the ways in which soldiers, in order to receive separation allowances, initially had to prove that they were legally married to their female partner. Right. In a region, again, where formal church marriage was relatively low. Instead, people tended to live in long-term domestic partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so one of the remarkable things that happened is that it's actually Afro-Caribbean women who launched protests insisting that their relationships be recognized through separation allowance payments as well. And they are successful. It's one of the earliest examples of British colonial officials recognizing these partnerships as legitimate by the recognition and the award of state resources. Mm-hmm. While you see this, the ways in which Afro-Caribbean women are able to make claims based on these relationships, many of the soldiers that I study continue to be invested in at least projecting this image of patriarchal head of household status. And
how would they project it?
So one of the sources that I draw upon a great deal are letters and petitions by soldiers. Mm-hmm. And so that and there's a chapter in the book that focuses on disabled veterans and the ways in which they pursue resources from the state. And over again, soldiers, even though they have extreme disabilities, will make claims not solely based on the fact that they've lost an arm or two or blind, but instead saying, I have a family to support. Right? My wife and children are utterly dependent on my wages. Right. Certainly there were cases where that was true, but it would have actually been unusual. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And so they are participating in this narrative of a male-centered breadwinner household.
The war actually affords them kind of a participation in a certain kind of
yes, it gives them a bureaucratic language valorizing that. So you not only see, the kind of familiar institutions like the church valorizing that family formation, but the military as well. That is the way in which they become legible as people claiming rights, in that these rights are not only for themselves, but for their household as well.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned your sources. I mean, one of the striking things about your work is the expansive archive. It's one thing to kind of to finally have someone answer C.L.R. James's call to write about the kind of Black West Indian, regiment, right? To pay attention to these Caribbean soldiers, but the way in which you do it. I mean, talk a little bit about your archive. Right, and how diverse and the challenges you face moving, not just simply through military records and the like, but also across different languages. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So anyone who has ever studied the military in any form will know it produces an endless series of records, for better or for worse. Right? So, of course, as you note, things like military records, the diaries of regiments, enlistment information, court-martial materials are very important to my work. But one of the key limitations of military documents is how infrequently the voices of the actors I'm most interested in are at the forefront. Right? So military records tend to give us a very top-down understanding of the life of soldiers, particularly rank-and-file colonial troops. Because I was interested in the political imaginaries and voices of both soldiers and their larger families, I turned to a variety of sources beyond the standard archive. I draw upon petitions and letters authored by soldiers and their larger family networks. That's where I was able to bring in the voices of women in particular. Mm-hmm. I also somewhat by accident, really, found incredible archives of poetry written during the war by soldiers as they're recovering in hospitals.
Talk a little bit about how did you find that?
Yes.
That's amazing.
So during reading newspapers during this moment, I kept encountering poems about the war, original poetry, generally very short, printed in Caribbean newspapers. And then doing research in the UK, I found the series of autograph books from a hospital that, among many other groups of soldiers, served as a site for aiding West Indian troops. And I was utterly shocked to see that as soldiers were recovering, they were also writing poems. They were also drawing illustrations about their time in the war. And so I draw upon this poetry as a way of thinking about the multiple genres in which soldiers and their loved ones are choosing to narrate their relationship to war. That the petition is certainly a really important genre of writing. To join the British West Indies Regiment, soldiers had to prove that they were literate for the first 2 years. And so I have the benefit of having an expansive written archive. But they also chose to write in these other forms as well, the kind of semi-private writing in an autograph book as you're recovering, or submitting poetry to the local newspaper as a way to narrate war. It's really remarkable when you think about these genres of writing in relation to one another.
So what struck you most? What was revealed most in this kind of... Because in some ways you get at the interiority of the folks who are participating in something that is for all intents and purposes very horrible. Right. So what struck you?
So two things really emerged strongly from the poems in particular. The first was the ways in which Afro-Caribbeans were reworking the language of imperial patriotism, that they were taking the tropes of loyalty and devotion and martial manhood and are making explicit connections between those imperial discourses and their status as racialized subjects. Over and over again, they're arguing that the pursuit of democracy is a racial project for them, that it is a project of self-fashioning and citizenship, and that they are taking discourses that are in some ways meant to conscript them into the project of empire, and arguing that using those logics to argue for a new class of rights and new standing. The other thing that really struck me in soldiers' writing is the way in which they will move so quickly from pretty formulaic discussions of the heroism of war to their own deep ambivalence about their role. And so in a recent publication, I wrote about a soldier who writes a series of poems about what it means to be stuck in a hospital bed as you hear troops marching by. And he begins with this kind of deeply heroic language about how he will overcome any obstacle thrown at him in the war. And then he moves to deeply evocative work about the ways in which his own body is failing him. Right. And I think that those moments are the kind of interior glimpse that you see of the contradictions of war, particularly for colonial subjects, as they are navigating a war that is both and imperial and democratic. Right? One of the challenges of this archive is how diffuse it is spatially. I worked in over a dozen archives in multiple Caribbean countries, as well as drawing upon colonial archives in Europe and the United States. And one of the remarkable things is that when you're studying people in motion, right, particularly working class people in motion, that you're chasing after fragments, right? So that it was very rare to find multiple letters in one archive from a soldier. Instead, I might find a birth certificate one place, information about enlistment in another place, and then see their name in a report from a UNIA division in another archive. Wow. It's also remarkable because so many of the soldiers, as I said, enlisted having already migrated. And then after the war, British colonial officials in Jamaica, Barbados, and several other islands actually sponsored veterans to migrate to Cuba. And around 40% of them did. And so that meant that I also really wanted to grapple with what did it mean for these veterans to move to Cuba at this moment where Cuba itself is a hotbed of Afro-Cuban organizing, labor union organizing, and anti-imperial organizing in relationship to the U.S. And so I'm both always excited about and daunted about the challenge of studying working class Black folks in motion.
I mean, this is amazing in so many different ways. But I hinted at this earlier. I think this is, your work is extraordinary for a number of different reasons. But I'm wondering what's the limit? What are the limits of this kind of political imagining? What are the constraints, moments in which you found in the source material where that martial self-conception, right, is a spur for organizing, for resisting, and at the same time it limits how that resistance can be imagined, if that makes sense, right?
No, it's a wonderful question. There are several moments in the 1920s and 30s where you see fractures, right, that military service provides a particular type of community, and as we've discussed, a particular vision of Black cosmopolitanism, one that is deeply gendered, and one that in the Caribbean context also excludes other working class people, not simply other Afro-Caribbean working class people who did not serve, but also there were several groups of colonial subjects in the region that were excluded from military service. So the large community of people of Indian descent in the Caribbean were not allowed to serve in the regiment. Also, there was very low participation of people of Chinese heritage in the region. And so the kind of claims making that soldiers are able to marshal fractures and ultimately helps to reinforce some of the racial and ethnic divisions in the region. Right. There's also a limit to the ways in which women can mobilize claims through soldiers. And this is one of the things that I'm deeply invested in, is both thinking about the ways in which women are able to argue that they too deserve rights and recognition because of their war effort, whether it's through fundraising or the loss of a son or husband during the war. But of course, that reinforces a narrative in which women's political rights are derivative of men's political action, right? And of course, that's a deeply troubling and limiting narrative. Also, by the 1930s, when veterans activism is at its height, what you see is a real fracture within the veterans community over the question of the political future of the British West Indies. Right. That you have political figures who explicitly embrace a kind of militant anti-colonialism, and others who argue that their primary leverage in seeking rights and recognition is through a continued relationship with the empire. And those debates come to a head in the 1930s when labor protests explode across the British Caribbean, really offering the most profound challenge to British empire in the early decades of the century.
And how are some of your folks behaving in this moment?
Yes, so in many different ways. And two of the soldiers that I'm most invested in, ones who would actually lead CLR James to be one of the earliest voices to say that veterans activism matters, are Arthur Cipriani and Uriah Butler. So Arthur Cipriani is actually a white Caribbean veteran from an elite background who serves as a really important mentor to CLR James. In fact, James calls him the greatest politician in the democratic tradition the West Indies has ever known. And Cipriani, from this elite background is transformed politically by the war. He enters as someone who had very little political experience and whose claim to fame was being an elite horse racer. And by his return is known as a champion of the barefoot man, becomes a populist hero in Trinidad. And the other is a man named Uriah Butler, who was born in Grenada but becomes politically active in Trinidad, who leads one of the largest demonstrations in this period of ferment and is actually imprisoned for sedition by the British government. And yet when he emerges from imprisonment, still argues that there might be some space for self-government within the empire.
Wow.
Right? So there are no easy or linear political trajectories. What is most interesting to me in this project is the ways in which these kind of moments of fracture, these debates about race and empire, don't have any formulaic conclusion. That there are soldiers who very early on said that there is no possibility for racial equality within the empire, and join organizations like the UNIA or Rastafari, or even more radical organizations like the Communist Party. And then there are other veterans who are just as active, who issue stinging public critique, and yet still find that there's this space for maneuver, if you will, within the political apparatus of empire.
So we get this title,
Yes.
Democracy Shall Be No Empty Romance. It seems like it reflects this messiness.
Yes. So the title comes from a short-lived Black periodical from Belize, the Belize Independent, which was edited by Garveyite Herbert Hill Kane. And the quotation is from an editorial welcoming soldiers back in July of 1919. And the full quotation is, "Liberty, equality, and fraternity shall no longer be mere catchwords, and democracy shall be no empty romance." I'm fascinated by this quotation for several reasons. One is that the ways in which the language of French republicanism, which is a language that soldiers often invoke, is central to that. And of course, that language of liberty, equality, and fraternity comes to Afro-Caribbean soldiers, not just through the French Revolution, but also through the Haitian Revolution. Right? So it has particular resonance in the Caribbean. And also the ways in which then this tradition of a kind of militant republicanism becomes attached to the rhetoric of democracy. This insistence that democracy can simply not mean political rights, but an expansive conception that democracy means a full citizenship.
Yeah, it's this odd, it's not odd, it's this interesting kind of mixture of French republicanism, as you rightly note, Black nationalism, and Wilsonianism, right? Because this notion of self-determination, right, is really defining the global landscape as it kind of sees or imagines itself post this extraordinary event called World War I, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I really wrestle with is the ways in which soldiers are drawing upon a really
bricoleurs of sorts.
Yes,
right.
That they're drawing from French republicanism, Black nationalism, Wilsonianism, to construct their own vernacular conceptions of democracy. Right? And so what does it mean if we read understandings of democracy in this moment from the perspective of working class Afro-Caribbean people, right? That this is a moment that the political landscape is quite literally saturated in the rhetoric of democracy. And yet, as many historians have documented, this is also the height of imperial expansion.
Exactly.
Right? And so I'm fascinated by the ways in which Black soldiers understand and read this moment and all of its contradictions and are speaking back to it by using the language of democracy in ways that, of course, terrified Wilson.
So the work, I mean, in so many ways, Reena, your work traverses disciplinary boundaries, even within history, right? So you work at the intersection of labor history, gender history, military history, in
its own unique way, right?
In Afro-Latin and Caribbean studies. So what's the payoff methodologically, substantively, right, of standing in that kind of interstitial space?
One of them is that the categories that have often divided the field of history begin to fall apart when you look at lived experience and take it really seriously as the ground from which you then theorize, right? So that what does it mean to think about labor history and intellectual history as parts of the same story, right? What does it mean to think about the politics of gender history, right? That these aren't insights that came to me in a kind of abstract way, that it is really the complex nature of wrestling with lived experience that made me realize, well, this isn't just social history.
Right.
This isn't just a story about masculinity. This isn't just a story about labor. But what makes this a really compelling story is that taking seriously the challenges and the contradictions of lived experience require multiple tools.
Right. It's almost at the heart of what we do in African American studies, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that African American studies for me has been generative in all kinds of ways. It is the field that introduced me to James and Frantz Fanon and Césaire and Claudia Jones. But it is also the field that taught me from my undergraduate days that the lived experience of working class Black people helps us to understand the world in a more complete and complex way.
Right.
And that these experiences aren't a marginal story, that these experiences are at the very center of how we can think about World War I, how we can think about questions of democracy, how we can think about the political fervor of the interwar period, right? And that is what continues to make me reinvest in this temporal period and in this project, is the lessons from this moment that continue to reverberate in our present.
And when we give attention to the lived experiences of everyday ordinary folk, what we see is that all the caricatures of Blackness,
yes,
right, these kind of easy ways of rendering how Black folk live their lives, right, seem to just fall apart.
Right. I have been amazed at how often, when talking about this project, that people have been surprised that working class Black folks had a conception of French republicanism, right? Or that they have vernacular conceptions of democracy and citizenship, right? And that they have their own intellectual genealogies.
Sophisticated intellectual genealogies,
right?
Yeah.
That come from things like a vibrant transnational Black press in this moment, that come from religious epistemologies, that come from a deep tradition of self-knowledge in the Caribbean and self-study, right? And that, I think, is one of the things that certainly within our field is well known and deeply valued, but beyond our field is still often a surprise.
Wow. So this book is on its way. Yeah, finally, you're giving it's being born. It'll make its way into the world over the next year or so, and then you're already hard at work on the next project.
Yes.
I think the title is Between Empires. Racial panics and U.S. annexation fears in the Greater Caribbean. Talk a little bit, and it's a broader period, right? You're actually going past World War II, right?
Yes.
Or up to World War II.
Yes. So the new project returns to my questions about race and empire, but in a larger temporal frame and a larger geographic frame, which is a bit scary because my first project had a pretty expansive
big, right.
geographic frame.
Right.
So in this new project, I turn to the world of cultural history, and in particular, the political impact of rumor, a subject that has often been at the heart of anthropological work, but it also has a really important history and historiography in the Caribbean context. So I ask in this project how Afro-Caribbean intellectuals are addressing the problem of the expansion of U.S. empire after 1898. And am particularly interested in what I'm describing as annexation panics, these recurring series of rumors that the United States is preparing to invade, purchase, or otherwise colonize new territories in the Caribbean.
Well, there's concrete evidence that something is going on, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Right. And so you have, after 1898, the moment in which the United States intervenes in the independent struggle in Cuba and does formally colonize Puerto Rico, right? This understanding that there has perhaps been a major political shift in the region, that a region that has been defined since 1492 by European colonialism is now falling under the political view of the United States. And so Afro-Caribbean intellectuals are now grappling with, what does that mean? What does it mean to grapple with not only the threat, but the reality of U.S. empire? And these annexation panics, of course, tick up after 1898, but then really begin to flourish after the United States purchases the Virgin Islands from Denmark, an event that still is woefully understudied in histories of U.S. empire. And the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands as a space, is also understudied in the field of Caribbean history. But this purchase of the Virgin Islands in 1917 reverberates throughout the Caribbean. So in this new project, I was shocked to discover that it sets off a panic among rural indentured laborers in Trinidad, right? Indian indentured workers, through circuits of information and rumor, are concerned about what this event will mean for them. One of the things I'm grappling with is how rumor serves as a source of political information for disenfranchised people, and a source of information that we must take seriously.
Do we see any tangible? So it generates panic.
Yes.
It deepens fears. But what's the politics that follow from
yes.
What's your research saying so far?
Yeah. So far, one of the kind of political impacts of this are all of these editorials and even formal published works on U.S. racial logics. So there is there's always been an interest in racial politics in the U.S. among Afro-Caribbean intellectuals in particular, but those debates moved to the public sphere. And one of the things you see are increased articles about the history of lynching in Caribbean newspapers. You see actual debates, sometimes formally organized public debates, other debates that take place in Black newspapers about comparing British and U.S. colonial practices. And you also see, in terms of the material realm, these efforts to sell off land occasionally as people are terrified, quite literally, about the prospect of coming under U.S. rule.
Because it's happening at the very moment in which racial apartheid in the South is consolidating. You know, that wonderful moment in C. Vann Woodward's, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. He said at the very moment in which Jim Crow is kind of taking shape, there is this annexation of millions of people of color. Under the American regime. So
absolutely. Another thing that you see is intense interest in the U.S. occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which are going on at this moment, as a test case, if you will, to understand and to observe what U.S. military occupation means for Black and brown people.
This has been an amazing conversation. It's so important on so many different levels. I cannot wait for Democracy Shall Be No Empty Romance, War and the Politics of Empire in the Greater Caribbean to hit the shelves. I can only imagine the conversations that will be happening all over the country. And, I think it's really important that you and I had this conversation today against the backdrop of what's happened in Puerto Rico and what's happened in the U.S. Virgin Islands and the kind of relative silence that we are witnessing to that devastation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a moment where the politics of empire are alive and well, and we see that in the ways in which both the response or really lack thereof to the response in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and also in Dominica and Barbuda, two places that are only very recently independent nations.
Right. So, indeed. So thank you all for joining us for this important discussion today. I would like to thank Professor Reena Goldthree for joining me this week. Additionally, a special thanks to Courtney Bryan for providing the music to this podcast, and to the staff of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, our office manager, April Peters, our event coordinator, Dion Worthy, our social media specialist, Allison Bland, and our technical specialist and audio engineer, Elio Leo. Remember, you can find this podcast and more by visiting our website, aas.princeton.edu. Thank you so much and have a good one. Take care.